troops each morning. At the Second Battle of Bedriacum, the Vitellians were finally defeated not by force, but by a completely harmless religious ritual. Despite their own exhaustion, Antonius' army closed the last few miles. First, they destroyed the Vitellian camp outside the walls, and then they launched a ferocious assault on the city itself. While the troops and citizens of the city fought off the attack, the officers of the Vitellian army lost hope. They set Caecina loose and begged him to negotiate a peace that would spare their lives. With the leadership of the army protecting them giving up, the civilian leadership of Cremona opened their own talks, and in short order, both the Vitellian legions and the people of Cremona emerged from the city to stand before the victorious Flavians. It was supposed to be a peaceful settlement, one with no sacking, but the tired, bloody, and angry Flavian troops were in no mood to be denied the loot they saw as rightfully theirs. They believed that they had been promised Cremona as a prize for the extreme effort they had just expended in taking it, but it seemed that the officers were now conspiring to deny them their prize. So when Antonius entered the city to take a hot bath, his absence allowed the restraint of his army to slip. 40,000 troops poured into Cremona, grabbing anything that wasn't nailed down and setting fire to the rest. When Vespasian learned what had happened, he denounced the actions of Antonius' army, and as emperor, he tried to rebuild the city, but it would never again rise to the prominence it had enjoyed since its founding just before the Second Punic War. The battle may not have marked the official end of the war, but it certainly dealt a heavy blow to Vitellius' chances. From this point on, practically everything pointed to an emperor destined to fall. Valens had been ordered north about a week after Caecina's departure, but his sluggish pace left him far from Cremona when he learned first of Caecina's attempted defection and then the sack of the city itself. He changed direction and tried to make for Gaul, where he'd be able to raise reinforcements. But by this point, practically every governor in the area was pledging allegiance to Vespasian. Valens was captured at sea by former members of Otho's Praetorian Guard, and then sent along to Antonius as a gift-wrapped present. Soon enough, Valens' head would be waved before the Vitellian troops as proof that further resistance was futile. Caecina and Valens had been the driving force behind Vitellius' bid for power, and now one of them had turned on him, and the other was dead. The emperor did not know what to do. He marched out of Rome with most of his new Praetorian Guard to make a stand, but upon hearing about more defections throughout the empire, he returned to Rome with half the troops at his disposal, leaving the rest in place to halt the advance of Antonius. As the Flavian army marched south, both Mucianus and Antonius opened up correspondence with Vitellius in an attempt to secure his abdication. They promised him his life, money, and a villa in Campania if he agreed to give up the throne willingly. Vitellius, in way over his head, was eager for the opportunity to get out of all of this with his life. So he took up negotiations with Vespasian's brother Flavius Sabinus, who was living in Rome at the time. But Vitellius' attempt to abdicate was thwarted by his own supporters. On December 18, the emperor gave a speech announcing that he was stepping down, much to the dismay of the loyal troops he still had with him. They had all staked their lives to this man, and now he was simply going to give up? Where did that leave them? So as Vitellius attempted to leave the forum, he was boxed in by members of his own Praetorian Guard and marched back to the palace, his resignation annulled by the tip of a spear. Sabinus was at home when he heard of Vitellius' attempted resignation, and he immediately headed down to the forum with an armed guard to issue a proclamation in his brother's name. But along the way, he was surprised to find the Vitellians had not in fact given up. A brief skirmish broke out, and Sabinus was driven up onto the Capitoline Hill, where he and his men barricaded themselves. Over the course of a night and a day, the Vitellian forces attempted to dislodge Sabinus, and in the process, the Temple of Jupiter, one of the most important temples in Rome, was burned to the ground. With the fire raging, the men who had surrounded Sabinus deserted him, and he was eventually captured by the Vitellians and executed. The execution of Vespasian's brother precluded all future negotiations. The army of Antonius, now only miles from Rome, learned of the incident and made straight away for the city. At first, Antonius hesitated, understandably nervous that attacking Rome itself would irreparably damage Vespasian's, and his own, reputation, to the point that even a victory would be a defeat. But his men convinced him that they ought not balk now that the empire was in their hands. Antonius divided his army into thirds and attacked at 3 different gates. 2 of the gates were easily breached, as they were only guarded by an untrained mix of civilian militia. But the fighting at the Colline Gate was intense. The outnumbered Vitellians were eventually pressed back and forced to make a last stand within the Praetorian camp. But despite heavy casualties, the Flavians finally breached the walls, led by the former members of Otho's Praetorian Guard, who viewed reclaiming the camp as a matter of personal honor. Vitellius was now all alone. His attempt to give up had failed, and he wandered the deserted imperial palace in shock, trying to figure out what to do next. Eventually, the incoming Flavian army stumbled upon him and took him prisoner. They marched him blubbering through the streets to the Steps of Lamentation, where he was unceremoniously beheaded as insults rained down upon him. His head was paraded through the city as a trophy, and his body thrown in the Tiber. Vitellius was 54 years old when he died, and had reigned for just over 9 months. His death would bring a violent close to a violent year. On the 20th of September, the Senate met and unanimously declared Vespasian emperor. It would be understandable if the no doubt skittish citizens of the empire were a bit skeptical that this really was an end to the chaos. But as the months passed into years, and no other pretender to the throne arose, they began to get comfortable with the idea that things had sort of returned to normal, that they could fully embrace this new dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. Before we go this week, I just want to mention that Lars Brownwell is in the process of gauging interest for a lecture tour in early 2010. Since we have so many listeners in common, they've asked me to ask you if anyone in and around Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Francisco would be interested in such a thing. I'm also going to add Austin, Texas to the list because that's where I live now and I think he should come down here. I'll post some links at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com so that you can either email superfan Detlef with your thoughts or sound off at the Forum Gallorum, the discussion community for the history of Rome that Detlef has set up. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 73, The Only Man Who Improved. At the beginning of his histories, Tacitus claims that the year 69 AD was very nearly the last of Rome's existence. While this can be easily set aside as dramatic exaggeration, there is no doubt that the last 18 months had taken their toll on the empire. Lives had been lost, property had been destroyed, and the rule of law had been thrown out the window. It would take more than a year of civil war to destroy the empire, but if things had gone on like they had been going since the suicide of Nero, the Romans very well could have been facing the end of their civilization. Luckily for the Romans, by the time the Senate recognized Vespasian as emperor in the last days of December 69 AD, the civil wars had already swept up all the legions from Spain to Syria and deposited them in Italy to fight it out. Anyone who was in a position to make a bid for the throne had already tried, so there was no one left to perpetuate the cycle of ascension and deposition once Vespasian's forces had overthrown Vitellius. So things did not go on as they had, and Roman civilization survived, battered but far from beaten. An important thing to take away from this reality is to understand that there was nothing special or divine or cosmic about Vespasian's rise. Unlike Marius or Sulla or Julius Caesar or Augustus, he did not really possess the phenomenal charisma or military brilliance that had allowed those men to outshine their rivals and remake their own world. He simply got into an exhausting tug-of-war later than the others had, and was thus able to outlast the last of them. This is not to say that he wasn't charismatic or intelligent, just that his fortuitous placement in the East at the beginning of the year had as much to do with his success as his own personality. But though he rode a wave of circumstance to power, essentially being in the right place at the right time, Rome's luck would mirror that of their new ruler. Vespasian turned out to be a pretty good emperor. In fact, his unremarkable biography up to that point prompted Tacitus to report that Vespasian was the only emperor in history to improve himself upon taking office. The first few weeks of his reign, however, did nothing to presage the moderate administration that he would be remembered for. Antonius's army had taken Rome by force, and unchecked by any higher power, the troops continued to run amok in the streets. The Praetorian Guard and the urban cohorts, who usually took the lead in maintaining law and order, were all either captured out on the frontiers or dead in the field. So there was no one to stand up to Antonius's army, as they treated Rome as if it was a captured enemy city. On top of everything, career criminals and citizens with old scores to settle masqueraded as Flavian soldiers and joined in the anarchic pillaging. Tacitus exaggerates when he says that 50,000 people were killed in those first bloody weeks, but there is no denying that the death toll would have been high. Things began to settle down when Mucianus arrived in the first week of January 70 AD. Antonius had been acting this whole time on his own initiative, and though the Flavian High Command had been smart enough to get out of the way of the man who was winning the war for them, that did not mean that Antonius represented Vespasian in any official or political sense. Mucianus, however, carried with him the seal of the new emperor, and was fully empowered to act in Vespasian's name. When he arrived with his armies, it was as if Vespasian himself had arrived, and Mucianus had both the ability and the ego to act the part. The first thing that needed to happen, obviously, was to get all the troops out of Rome. The city had been occupied for months by squatting legionaries, and the resulting chaos, death, and property damage had to be dealt with. Antonius's legions were either ordered back from whence they came, or, in a few cases, reassigned to the Rhine to help bolster the now weakened garrison there. With order restored, Mucianus set about consolidating Vespasian's political position. Or, I suppose I should really say, Mucianus set about consolidating Mucianus's political position, and then he took care of Vespasian's business. He rewarded Antonius's service by offering him Galba's old proconsular position in Spain, quickly removing one of the two key rivals for power he needed to neutralize before he felt secure in his position. The other key rival was 18-year-old Domitian, the youngest son of Vespasian, who had spent the year of the four emperors in Rome. Immediately following Vitellius's death, Flavian supporters had brought the boy out of hiding, declared him Caesar, and paraded him around as their natural leader. When Mucianus arrived in the city, though, he placed Domitian under his personal protection and promised to keep the boy safe until his father arrived to collect him. In other words, don't anybody get confused. I'm in charge here, not the boy. Then he set to work, settling Vespasian's scores. In all of this, the new emperor was blessed by remaining physically absent from the city. He could thus plausibly disavow first the carnage wrought by Antonius's army, and then the purge overseen by Mucianus. It had taken a lot of blood to put Vespasian on the throne, but none of it actually wound up on his hands. When he finally arrived in Rome in mid to late 70, he was greeted warmly by a population who